February 4, 2026. U.S. markets are reacting to confirmation of Project Vault, a federal program authorizing up to $12 billion for the acquisition and stockpiling of critical minerals, including rare earth elements, at a time when supply chains remain heavily concentrated in China. The announcement arrives amid elevated metals prices, persistent geopolitical risk, and renewed government focus on strategic reserves. The disclosure marks the first formal acknowledgement of a coordinated federal buyer operating at scale in critical minerals markets. Officials confirmed the program's intent to secure long-term supply for defense, energy, and advanced manufacturing, while reducing exposure to foreign supply disruptions. Project Vault establishes a centralized purchasing mechanism backed by federal funding authority, moving beyond policy statements into direct market participation. The timing coincides with continued volatility across commodity markets and heightened scrutiny of national stockpiles following recent trade restrictions and export controls affecting key industrial inputs. Early confirmation of federal participation signals a structural shift in resource policy with implications for pricing, availability, and long-term investment planning across strategic materials markets globally, starting immediately today. Project Vault was formally introduced as a federal initiative designed to build a domestic stockpile of critical minerals considered essential for national security and industrial resilience. The program authorizes direct government purchases rather than indirect incentives, positioning the federal government as an active participant in commodities markets that have historically been dominated by private buyers and foreign processors. Officials outlined that Project Vault focuses on materials classified as critical under existing U.S. policy frameworks, including rare earth elements used in defense systems, semiconductors, renewable energy infrastructure, and advanced electronics. The program is structured to prioritize physical acquisition and storage rather than financial exposure through derivatives or paper contracts, reinforcing the emphasis on supply security over price management. The scope of the initiative extends beyond rare earths alone. Authorities confirmed that the mandate allows purchases across a broader basket of strategic materials where supply concentration poses economic or security risk. These include minerals central to battery technology, aerospace manufacturing, and grid infrastructure, reflecting lessons learned from recent supply disruptions and export controls. Project Vault is not positioned as an emergency response but as a standing capability. The framework allows phased accumulation over multiple years, with procurement paced to market conditions and availability. This approach is intended to avoid destabilizing short-term price spikes, while steadily increasing reserve levels to meet long-term strategic targets. The program also integrates coordination with existing federal agencies responsible for defense procurement and energy security. While operational details remain limited, officials emphasized alignment with current strategic reserve policies rather than the creation of a parallel system. Storage, logistics, and inventory management are expected to leverage existing infrastructure where feasible. Importantly, Project Vault represents a shift from reliance on regulatory measures and diplomatic engagement toward direct market action. By committing capital to physical stockpiles, the government signals a willingness to absorb near-term costs in exchange for reduced vulnerability to external supply shocks. The announcement clarifies that Project Vault is designed to complement, not replace, private sector investment. Officials stated that the program is intended to stabilize access during periods of disruption, not to control pricing or crowd out commercial buyers. This distinction is central to how the initiative is expected to interact with global markets as implementation begins. Market participants are expected to monitor procurement pacing closely, as even gradual accumulation by a price-insensitive buyer can influence long-term supply expectations. The formalization of Project Vault establishes a durable policy signal that critical minerals are now treated as strategic assets, comparable in importance to energy reserves and defense stockpiles' nationwide security. Project Vault is authorized with a funding ceiling of $12 billion, establishing a clear upper bound while allowing flexibility in execution. The allocation is structured to support multi-year procurement rather than a single disbursement, enabling purchases to be staged in response to market liquidity, availability, and storage readiness. Funding authority is routed through existing federal budget mechanisms rather than an emergency appropriation. This design reduces implementation friction and permits coordination with agencies already managing strategic materials and defense supply chains. Officials indicated that expenditures will be recorded as asset acquisitions, with physical inventory held on the federal balance sheet, distinguishing the program from subsidy or grant frameworks. The scale is significant relative to niche critical minerals markets. While $12 billion is modest compared with energy reserves, it represents substantial potential demand in segments where annual global trade values are limited and processing capacity is concentrated. As a result, procurement cadence and contract structure are central to minimizing market distortion. Purchasing is expected to rely on negotiated contracts, offtake agreements, and spot acquisitions where appropriate. The framework allows for forward commitments tied to future production. supporting supply development without immediate delivery in all cases. Payment schedules may align with milestones to reduce counterparty risk and ensure compliance with quality and origin requirements. Financial oversight is embedded through standard federal auditing and reporting processes. Inventory valuation will be based on acquisition cost rather than mark-to-market pricing, insulating the program from short-term volatility in reported results. This accounting treatment underscores the strategic, non-speculative nature of the reserves. Storage and carrying costs are incorporated into the funding envelope. These include secure warehousing, environmental controls, insurance, and periodic quality verification. Officials emphasize that total program cost extends beyond purchase price, reinforcing the need for disciplined pacing and prioritization among materials. Importantly, the funding structure does not mandate full utilization of the authorized amount. Deployment is contingent on market conditions and assess supply risk, allowing the program to pause or accelerate without additional legislative action. This optionality reduces the likelihood of forced buying during illiquid or stressed market periods. From a market perspective, the presence of a funded discretionary buyer alters long-term demand expectations. Even without immediate large-scale purchases, the authorization itself changes the calculus for producers, financiers, and downstream users planning capital allocation and capacity expansion. For investors and policymakers, the mechanics emphasize durability over speed, signaling sustained engagement rather than a one-time intervention, with budgeted flexibility intended to preserve operational discipline while aligning procurement decisions with evolving assessments of strategic vulnerability across supply chains, fiscal cycles, and interagency governance structures, nationwide oversight. The list of materials eligible for acquisition under Project Vault aligns with the federal government's existing critical minerals framework, which prioritizes inputs essential to defense systems, advanced manufacturing, energy infrastructure, and emerging technologies. Rare earth elements sit at the core of the program, reflecting their role in precision-guided munitions, radar systems, electric motors, and permanent magnets used across military and civilian applications. Beyond rare earths, the mandate extends to minerals central to electrification and digital infrastructure. These include lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and manganese, all of which are integral to battery production for electric vehicles, grid-scale storage, and backup power systems. The inclusion of these materials reflects both growing domestic demand and the strategic importance of secure access as electrification accelerates. Project Vault also encompasses materials used in aerospace, semiconductors, and telecommunications. Gallium, germanium, and similar specialty metals are critical for high-frequency chips, fiber optics, and satellite systems. Recent export controls and licensing regimes affecting these materials have underscored the vulnerability of supply chains where production and processing are geographically concentrated. The strategic rationale centers on supply concentration rather than absolute scarcity. Many of the targeted minerals are geologically abundant, but processing capacity, refining expertise, and downstream integration remain heavily clustered outside the United States. In several cases, a single country controls a dominant share of global refining or magnet production, creating exposure to policy decisions beyond U.S. control. Project Vault addresses this risk by focusing on physical availability rather than price hedging. Stockpiling is intended to provide a buffer against temporary disruptions, trade restrictions, or geopolitical escalation, buying time for alternative supply chains to scale. The program is structured to complement domestic production initiatives by ensuring that critical inputs remain available during periods of transition. Officials emphasize that material selection is driven by functional importance and substitution limits. Many of the minerals covered lack near-term substitutes without performance degradation or redesign. In defense and grid applications, substitution is often impractical, reinforcing the need for assured supply rather than market-based alternatives alone. The program also reflects a reassessment of just-in-time procurement models. Recent disruptions demonstrated that lean inventories can amplify systemic risk when supply chains are stressed simultaneously across multiple sectors. Project Vault reintroduces inventory as a strategic tool, prioritizing resilience over efficiency in narrowly defined but high-impact areas. Selection criteria incorporate downstream demand visibility, storage feasibility, and degradation risk. Not all critical materials are equally suited to long-term storage, and procurement plans account for shelf life, handling requirements, and quality maintenance. This technical screening narrows the focus to materials where stockpiling delivers clear strategic benefit. By defining critical minerals as strategic assets rather than commodities, Project Vault embeds long-term security considerations into resource policy. The approach elevates materials traditionally treated as industrial inputs into the same policy category as energy reserves, reflecting their growing importance to national capability, economic continuity, and technological sovereignty across defense, infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing systems. The strategic backdrop for Project Vault is defined by persistent supply chain concentration, particularly in China, across multiple stages of critical minerals production. While raw material extraction occurs in several regions, processing, refining, and component manufacturing remain heavily centralized, creating structural dependencies that extend beyond mining alone. In rare earth elements, China maintains a dominant position in refining and magnet production, which are the most technically complex and capital-intensive segments of the supply chain. Even where alternative mining projects exist, downstream processing capacity outside China remains limited, constraining the ability to fully diversify supply in the near term. This imbalance has persisted despite years of policy discussion and incremental investment. Similar dynamics apply to battery-related materials. Lithium extraction is geographically dispersed, but conversion into battery-grade chemicals is concentrated. Nickel and cobalt supply chains show comparable patterns, with refining and precursor production clustered in a small number of jurisdictions. These choke points expose downstream manufacturers to policy risk, export controls, and logistical disruptions. Recent trade measures and export licensing requirements affecting specialty metals have reinforced awareness of these vulnerabilities. While not all restrictions target the United States directly, the cumulative effect has been to increase uncertainty around availability, delivery timelines, and compliance risk for global buyers. For defense and infrastructure planners, this uncertainty carries operational implications rather than purely commercial ones. Project Vault responds to this exposure by treating supply concentration as a strategic risk in its own right. The objective is not to replace foreign supply, but to reduce sensitivity to short-term disruptions while longer-term diversification efforts proceed. Stockpiling provides a temporal buffer, allowing essential functions to continue during periods of constrained access. The program also reflects recognition that market-based responses alone may be insufficient. In concentrated markets, price signals do not always produce rapid capacity expansion, particularly where environmental permitting, technical expertise, and capital intensity create long development timelines. Government participation alters this dynamic by absorbing inventory risk and smoothing demand across cycles. From a geopolitical perspective, the initiative aligns with broader efforts to reframe critical materials as national security inputs rather than purely commercial commodities. This framing supports coordination across defense, energy, and industrial policy, without relying solely on trade negotiations or diplomatic assurances. However, the exposure is not uniform across all materials. Some minerals face higher concentration at the refining stage, while others are constrained at the component or manufacturing level. Project Vault's flexible mandate allows prioritization based on where disruption would have the most immediate systemic impact. The focus on physical reserves also acknowledges limits to rapid substitution. In many advanced systems, redesigning components to eliminate specific materials requires lengthy testing and certification. Stockpiles mitigate this rigidity by ensuring continuity while alternatives are evaluated or developed. Importantly, the program does not eliminate exposure to global markets. Even with reserves, sustained disruptions would eventually require replenishment or substitution. Project Vault is positioned as a risk management tool rather than a permanent solution, bridging the gap between current dependence and future diversification. For markets, the acknowledgement of concentration risk at the federal level formalizes what participants have long understood informally. By quantifying and funding a response, the government embeds supply chain resilience into fiscal planning, signaling that exposure to concentrated foreign processing is no longer viewed as an acceptable baseline condition for materials deemed critical to national function. Financial markets responded to the confirmation of Project Vault with measured but observable adjustments across metals, mining equities, and related commodities. Price movements were not disorderly, reflecting the absence of immediate large-scale spot purchases, but forward-looking expectations shifted as participants incorporated the presence of a funded, strategic buyer into medium and long-term demand assumptions. Rare earth-related equities showed relative outperformance compared with the broader materials sector, particularly among companies with exposure to non-Chinese processing and magnet production. The response reflected expectations of increased contract opportunities and improved demand visibility rather than near-term revenue impact. Physical rare earth pricing remained firm, with limited liquidity constraining rapid repricing. Battery metals markets displayed a more muted reaction. Lithium and nickel prices were already influenced by inventory levels, electric vehicle demand trends, and recent capacity additions. Project Vault did not materially alter near-term balances, but it contributed to a reassessment of downside risk, particularly in scenarios involving trade restrictions or policy-driven disruptions. Forward curves reflected slightly higher implied floor prices, without sharp moves in spot markets. Gold markets registered indirect attention rather than direct linkage. While gold is not the primary focus of Project Vault, the broader theme of strategic stockpiling reinforced perceptions of renewed government interest in tangible reserves. Gold prices remained influenced primarily by interest rate expectations, currency movements, and central bank activity. but the policy signal supported the narrative of physical assets retaining strategic relevance. Industrial metals such as copper and aluminum were largely unaffected, reflecting their diversified supply chains and deep liquidity. Market participants differentiated between broadly traded commodities and narrowly supplied critical materials, limiting spillover effects. This segmentation reduced the risk of generalized commodity inflation stemming from the announcement. In derivatives markets, there was no evidence of panic hedging or disorderly repositioning. Options activity suggested incremental adjustments rather than wholesale repricing of risk. The absence of immediate procurement timelines limited speculative behavior, reinforcing the perception of Project Vault as a structural policy shift rather than an acute demand shock. Mining companies with advanced stage projects and critical minerals saw modest valuation support, particularly where production timelines align with potential government offtake agreements. Early-stage exploration assets experienced less impact, reflecting continued emphasis on execution risk and capital requirements. From a capital markets perspective, the announcement contributed to a broader reassessment of strategic materials as policy-sensitive assets. Analysts began factoring government demand as a stabilizing element rather than a cyclical variable, potentially influencing cost of capital assumptions for qualifying projects. Overall, the market reaction was characterized by recalibration rather than volatility. Prices adjusted at the margin. Equities reflected improved strategic relevance, and risk assessments incorporated the durability of government participation. The response underscored that while Project Vault does not immediately alter supply-demand balances, it meaningfully changes the policy backdrop against which critical minerals markets will be evaluated going forward. Project Vault carries broader implications for gold, strategic reserves, and capital allocation decisions, even though gold is not formally designated as a target material under the program. The initiative reinforces a policy preference for physical ownership of strategic assets, aligning with a wider global trend among governments prioritizing tangible reserves over financial instruments. Gold remains governed by distinct market dynamics, including central bank purchases, interest rate expectations, and currency movements. However, the framing of critical materials as assets requiring direct state custody contributes to a narrative shift that favors physical over paper exposure. This perspective has gained traction amid concerns about supply security, settlement risk, and geopolitical fragmentation. Strategic reserves historically focused on energy commodities and precious metals. Project Vault extends this framework into industrial inputs, signaling that materials enabling modern defense systems and infrastructure are now viewed through a similar lens. This evolution broadens the definition of reserve assets and may influence how governments evaluate portfolio diversification within sovereign holdings. For capital markets, the policy signal alters investment horizons. Government participation as a long-term holder reduces sensitivity to short-term price volatility and introduces a non-commercial demand component. This can support financing for capital-intensive projects by improving demand certainty, particularly where private offtake agreements have been difficult to secure. The emphasis on physical stockpiles also interacts with ongoing debates around financialization in commodities markets. In recent years, increased use of derivatives and synthetic exposure has amplified volatility in some segments. Project Vault's structure, focused on physical acquisition and storage, stands in contrast to these trends and underscores a preference for material control rather than financial abstraction. Institutional investors are likely to differentiate more clearly between commodities with strategic backing and those driven purely by cyclical demand. Materials aligned with national security objectives may attract a different risk assessment framework, incorporating policy durability alongside traditional fundamentals. This could influence asset allocation decisions within resource-focused portfolios. The program also intersects with discussions around reserve adequacy and redundancy. While gold reserves provide monetary and confidence functions, critical minerals reserves serve operational continuity. Together, they form complementary layers of resilience, addressing different dimensions of systemic risk. Importantly, Project Vault does not imply abandonment of market mechanisms. Prices remain the primary allocator of supply and demand, and private capital remains essential for production expansion. The program's role is additive, providing a backstop rather than a replacement for commercial markets. For policymakers, the initiative highlights a willingness to deploy balance sheet capacity in service of long-term resilience objectives. For investors, it reinforces the relevance of policy alignment when evaluating resource exposure. The convergence of strategic stockpiling, supply chain risk management, and capital planning reflects a structural adjustment rather than a cyclical response. In sum, while gold markets continue to respond to traditional macro drivers, Project Vault contributes to a broader revaluation of physical assets within national strategy. The implications extend beyond individual commodities, shaping expectations around how governments may engage with critical resources as geopolitical and economic conditions evolve. Project Vault faces a set of operational, financial, and market constraints that will shape its effectiveness over time. While the authorization provides flexibility, execution depends on procurement discipline, storage capacity, and coordination across agencies with differing mandates and timelines. One primary constraint is market liquidity. Many targeted critical minerals trade in relatively thin markets, where large purchases can influence prices even when paced gradually. Managing this risk requires careful sequencing of contracts and diversification of counterparties to avoid concentrating demand in narrow windows or regions. Storage presents another challenge. Unlike energy commodities or precious metals, some critical minerals require specialized handling to prevent degradation or contamination. Long-term storage introduces technical risks, including quality deterioration and verification costs, which must be managed to preserve usability rather than merely inventory volume. Supply availability may also limit deployment. In several materials, production growth is constrained by permitting timelines, environmental requirements, and processing bottlenecks. Government funding alone cannot accelerate these factors in the short term, potentially slowing accumulation even where strategic need is identified. There are also trade and diplomatic considerations. While Project Vault is framed as a defensive measure, increased government buying could be perceived as market intervention by producing countries. Balancing procurement with broader trade relationships will be necessary to avoid unintended friction or retaliatory measures. Fiscal oversight remains a key consideration. Although inventory is carried at acquisition cost, budget scrutiny may intensify during periods of price weakness or surplus capacity. Maintaining political support requires demonstrating that reserves provide tangible resilience benefits rather than speculative exposure. Another risk lies in misalignment between stockpiled materials and evolving technology. Demand profiles for specific minerals can change as manufacturing processes adapt or substitution becomes viable. Overconcentration in materials with declining relevance would reduce the program's strategic value, underscoring the need for periodic reassessment. Coordination with private sector activity is also critical. If government procurement crowds out commercial buyers or distorts incentives, it could slow private investment rather than support it. Clear signaling and predictable engagement are necessary to ensure complementarity rather than displacement. Finally, Project Vault operates within a global system. Stockpiles provide temporary insulation but do not eliminate dependence on international markets. Prolonged disruptions would test reserve adequacy and replenishment capacity, highlighting that stockpiling is a mitigation tool rather than a comprehensive solution. These constraints do not undermine the program's rationale, but they define its boundaries. Effectiveness will depend less on authorization size than on execution quality, adaptability, and alignment with broader supply chain diversification efforts already underway across defense, energy, and industrial policy domains. Project Vault represents a structural adjustment in U.S. resource policy rather than a short-term market intervention. By authorizing direct federal participation in critical minerals markets, the program formalizes supply security as a fiscal and operational priority alongside energy reserves and defense procurement. The $12 billion authorization establishes scale without mandating immediate deployment, preserving flexibility while signaling durability. This balance reduces the risk of market disruption while embedding government demand into long-term planning assumptions for producers, processors, and downstream users. The initiative responds to clearly identified supply chain concentration risks, particularly in processing and manufacturing stages where diversification remains limited. Stockpiling does not resolve these structural issues, but it provides time and continuity during periods of disruption, supporting national functions while alternative capacity develops. Market reactions to date reflect recalibration rather than volatility. Pricing adjustments have been incremental. Equities have responded selectively, and derivatives markets show no signs of stress. This suggests that participants view Project Vault as a policy anchor rather than an immediate demand shock. For capital allocation, the program reinforces the strategic relevance of certain materials and may support investment by improving demand visibility. However, execution risks, storage constraints, and evolving technology profiles require disciplined management to avoid misallocation or obsolescence. Project Vault also reinforces a broader policy preference for physical assets where supply assurance is critical. This approach contrasts with financialized exposure and underscores a willingness to accept carrying costs in exchange for resilience. The signal extends beyond individual commodities, influencing how strategic risk is assessed across resource markets. Ultimately, the program's impact will be determined by implementation rather than authorization. Procurement pacing, material selection, and coordination with private and international partners will define whether stockpiles enhance resilience without distorting markets. As of today, Project Vault marks a clear shift in how critical minerals are treated within U.S. policy. The federal government has moved from advocacy and incentives to direct ownership, embedding supply security into balance sheet planning and reshaping expectations for strategic materials markets in the years ahead.